Welcome, everyone. I'm Michel Alhadeff-Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunkhronos Institute and founder of the Temporalities, Rhythms, and Complexity Lab. The mission of the TRC Lab is to develop and promote a better understanding of the different temporalities which pace and constrain individual and collective lives. The aim of this lab is to develop original theoretical contributions and innovative methods of research and training to facilitate the recognition, the interpretation, the organization, and the transformation of the rhythms that shape people's existence in their everyday life and in a lifelong perspective. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to the second edition of the TRC Lab Research Symposium series. In 2023, we've explored the connection between spaces, times, and rhythms in the field of adult education. This year, the TRC Lab Research Symposium series will keep exploring rhythms-related contributions as we choose to focus more specifically on rhythm analysis. Our goal is to enrich previous and present initiatives such as seminars that were organized at Goldsmith University by Paula Crespi, the seminar Rhythmologie, currently organized in France by Luc Drzedienski and Christian Graff, or transdisciplinary platforms such as Rhythmos.eu, curated by Pascal Michon. As co-host of this series, Fadia Dakka, Gaia Del Negro, and myself are excited to continue this intellectual journey, deepening our understanding of what is at stake when researchers and practitioners choose to pay specific attention to the rhythms that compose the situations they are involved in, whatever field they are working in. We are also looking forward to establishing more connections among us, maintaining a thoughtful and inclusive atmosphere. Both as an object of inquiry and as an interpretive lens, rhythm can offer untapped spaces for experimentation in human sciences, but equally, it raises methodological dilemmas, especially at the stage of operationalization. What does it mean to analyze rhythms? Beyond metaphors, what rhythms are we talking about? How do we perceive them, describe them, put a value on them, and eventually choose to privilege some rather than others when it comes to pace and synchronize activities we are involved in? In this series of webinars, we would like to explore methods, research designs, and clinical orientations developed from or inspired by thinkers such as Henri Lefebvre, Gaston Bachelard, or more recent contributions like those of Pascal Michon, Pierre Sauvanet, or Dan Lyon. We are going to be 7 scholars, including ourselves, from Brazil, Italy, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, who have worked with rhythm analysis in their respective fields or across disciplines to share their experiences and foster debate around its affordances and limitations from a methodological perspective. This series is also designed to enable a collective reflection on the current state of affairs and potentialities of rhythm analytical research and practice. We would like to hear about new and existing ways of researching with rhythm analysis and discuss how this might inform ways of teaching, learning, consulting, and coaching that are concerned with critical self-reflection, transformational, and/or emancipatory processes. This research symposium series welcomes non-specialist audiences alongside experts in the field as it aims to reinforce the ranks of a growing international and transdisciplinary community of rhythm scholars and practitioners. Participation in this research symposium series is free and open to anyone. Each Zoom session starts with a presentation from the main speaker, approximately 45 minutes, and it followed by a discussion with the audience, approximately 40 minutes. The whole will be recorded, but only the main speaker's presentation will be posted online on the Sunkhronos Institute's YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe to be updated when we post new videos. That being said, I'm very happy to introduce my dear colleagues and friends, Fadia Dakka and Gaia Del Negro, who will co-host this series with me. I also would like to acknowledge the support of Monica Stab, who will help us manage these webinars and who will actively follow the chat. So feel free to post comments and questions as we move on. Today, Fadia and myself will introduce the theme of this series by focusing respectively on rhythm analysis as a method and rhythmic intelligence as a way to conceive the knowledge and skills it may involve. Then we'll open up the conversation with the audience and we'll reply to questions.
Thank you, Michel, and welcome everyone. Thank you for doing the honors and introducing the series. You made my life easier by skipping some of the information. And I will just add that I am also part of the TRC lab with Michel and Gaia, and I am a senior researcher in higher education based in Birmingham, UK. So to the benefit of those of you connected who don't really know anything about rhythm analysis and Lefebvre, I will start from the basic, and bear in mind I will paint a picture with very broad brushes because the purpose of today's sessions and introduction is to set the scene for the seminar that will be focused on rhythm analysis as a method. The author of Elements of Rhythm Analysis, to be fair, together with Catherine Regulier, the last wife of Henri Lefebvre, was this very famous French philosopher, but also sociologist, I think, and I believe it was the first sociology professor of France, but also literary critic, Marxist scholar, urbanist, geographer, amateur musician. He was many things. This is an eclectic figure. I really like always to start introducing the character by using Merrifield's very interesting biographical note on him. Too communist to be a romantic and too romantic to be a communist, with a body of work that really spans the entire 20th century and that defies pigeonholing and classification. So we already have from this a few biographical notes on the eclecticism of Lefebvre, something that is carried forward in the work and in particular in rhythm analysis, which was the very last book that he wrote just before dying in 1991. So the book was published posthumously in 1992. And rhythm analysis is effectively or de facto considered to be the fourth and final volume of a bigger work that spanned the life of Lefebvre, which was Critique of the Everyday Life, where he lays out the method, his notion of critique, but also his political credo. As I said, in very, very broad brushes, although there are differences in interpretations of rhythm analysis and also differences in understanding the relevance of the text in relation to the body of work of Lefebvre, we can say that there are three philosophical undercurrents that traverse rhythm analysis. One is the phenomenological dimension to it. There is a strong focus on perceptual relations and on the body at the center of these interrelations. You know, Lefebvre in rhythm analysis writes very clearly and explicitly that we should never lose sight of the body. Rhythm in this sense is also considered as a sensorium or as a gestalt sense. And we hear echoes in this kind of approach to rhythm analysis of Heidegger's existentialism and the notion of being in the world, of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception, and clearly Husserl's phenomenology of embodiment. Rhythm analysis is also very much traversed by his understanding of temporality as non-linear, and the theory of moment, which, although not explicitly addressed in rhythm analysis, is part of the underlying discussions about lived time and moments. And finally, last but not least, there is a hint or a nod to new materialism, in the sense that there is a clear and strong emphasis on the materiality and processes of materialization. Rhythm is considered to be a localized temporality and a temporalized spatiality. And in that, what counts is the timing spaces of the practices of the social agents involved in everyday life. So, as already mentioned by Michel, really, if you want to explore in more depth and detail the literatures that are related to rhythm, including rhythm analysis, I really direct you to the work of philosopher and historian Pascal Michon. He has an extensive repository of works, published work in different languages on the website Rhythmos, but also his own body of work, truly extensive, including, but not limited to the series Elements of Rhythmology. There you can find a much deeper and much more detailed and accurate definition and description of all things rhythm. For the purposes of this presentation and brief outline, it will suffice to say that when we talk about rhythm analysis, here we are talking about bodies in space and patterns of activities and movements, with a particular attention paid to the mutual contingency of the spatial and the social, of time and space, and of place and space in the analysis of the everyday. And the importance of rhythm in the social and as a social activity is that through rhythm, as a privileged lens, we can appreciate the making and remaking of social practice. And in particular, its relation to repetition of routines, the emergence of differences from these routines, which is, again, hinting to becoming, change, and transformation. A rhythmic analysis or a rhythm analysis is a mode of analysis that extends to all kind of activities, physiological and psychological states, and things between inverted commas, such as capitalism, commodities, institutions, work, training, learning, music, pathological states, atmospheres, and so on and so forth, on the assumption that these can be read as rhythmic assemblages or occurrences. If we want to look at a definition of rhythm, in rhythm analysis, we find a very parsimonious and not so helpful in terms of practical operationalization of rhythm offered by Lefebvre, as in the combination and conjunction or the meeting point between time, space, and energy. Obviously, this doesn't really help in developing a method from it. But rhythm is also characterized by the presence of repetition, difference, measure, linearity, cyclicity. These are dimensions of rhythms that are present and that Lefebvre mentions in rhythm analysis. If we start getting closer to a more specific form of, or an attempt at operationalizing that, we could use Pierre Sauvanet's definition of rhythm that I think clarifies some of these aspects by highlighting how to have rhythm, we need to have at least two of the three dimensions that he defines as pattern, periodicity, and movement. So we begin to see that the challenge of rhythm analysis turned into a method or a set of methods is connected to its very nature as a heuristic, very much suggestive, experimental in nature, historical, embodied, fundamentally sensory, but also traveling, nomadic, and transdisciplinary set of practices. And I like to go back to the work of Yi Chen here. She's written in 2017 a book called Practicing Rhythm Analysis, and introduced a very innovative form of archival rhythm analysis for historical, cultural, and historical research. And I think she really circumscribes the question of rhythm as a method here when she says that there are no disciplinary boundaries that delimits the trajectories of materialities, and that in the rhythm analytical mode of exploring the connections and experiences, abstract demarcations of all social fields are collapsed. So in many ways, we see that rhythm analysis will be, as a method, responsive to any type of methodological discussions that calls for research that situates itself amidst as opposed to above social phenomena. There are no particular or cultural and political starting points or allegiances. the nature of rhythm analysis. And here, we go back to that kind of emphasis on the processes of materialization and on the emergent qualities that go back and looks specifically at the concrete social relations and exchanges that are exercised by, as she calls it, the timing spacing practices of social agents. Another element that is the fascinating character of rhythm analysis, but also a potential challenge when we think of it as a method, is the clear poetic dimension to it. It's a poetic dimension that is deliberate and that also has a political function. If we look at rhythm analysis in its genesis within the body of work of Lefebvre. So it is very important to go back to the kind of Marxist roots that are encapsulated in the critique of abstraction, and in particular in the critique of concrete abstraction, as Marx develops it from Hegel's notions of concrete universal. And that kind of critique of abstraction, that it is seen and detectable as the engine, if you like, of capitalist production, accumulation and distribution in and of urban space and time. It is to this kind of abstraction that Lefebvre reacts and rejects and uses rhythm analysis as an antidote to these kind of abstracting modalities of existence that cause essentially alienation. And there is a strong sense that the kind of antidote to abstraction is to be found in the contact with artistic practices, and in particular, the connection with the avant-garde movement, the Situationist International, are very important in the history of development of rhythm analysis for Lefebvre. Essentially, at the heart of rhythm analysis and of the poetic element of poetic and unruly nature of rhythm and rhythm analysis, there is the search and the quest for a reappropriation of the time space of existence, the ability that goes through the ability of transforming society to reconfigure what he calls the total body. And here we hear echoes of the total man, the total woman. There is a kind of echoes of Nietzschean thinking about the Übermensch. The final objective and goal is to transform the urban and society as, a work of art in the experience and the lived experience of human beings that will be liberated from alienation and find their own, true nature, if you like. So we see that there is more than a qualitative, with rhythm analysis, that there is more than a qualitative methodology at stake for the observation of rhythms. But the nature of this kind of experimentation can and should be associated with practices of an experimental utopia. In rhythm analysis, we find an outline, a rough guideline for this sort of applied poetics that he's envisioning. But there is clearly a sense of a style for urban living, what Marielle Massé calls stylistic of existence, that is, again, outlined in the kind of poetic, evocative images that he gives us in rhythm analysis. And now we move to the kind of more specific point where, let's say, the methodological challenges meet the opportunity for experimentation. Rhythm analysis was published posthumously, as we know, and it's been interpreted variously. His importance has been either downplayed or overplayed. René Louraud defined it as the secret garden in Lefebvre's long and intense intellectual career, but also anticipated the obvious difficulty in a methodology that has the ambition of mixing all kind of knowledge in a unified theory. There is an ambition to create, to found a new science of rhythms. What we know is that in this approach, in this disposition and orientation for research, we will have a method or an approach to research that will be inevitably led by philosophy and hopefully turned into a theory. The main concern for the rhythm analyst is not just to observe the rhythms of existence, but to analyze them and to find a systematic way, perhaps a rigorous way, to say what they reveal about what they are supposed to connect, which is time, space, and energy. So there is an issue here at stake in rhythm analysis and in the rhythm analysis as a method, which is the qualification of the rhythm, the critique and differentiation that I'm sure Michel will touch on in his presentation. Another challenge and opportunity is connected with the fact that rhythm analysis doesn't have any pretense to objectivity, to scholarly detachment from what is being researched. So the implication in the spectacle is fundamental to the explication of the spectacle. So the rhythm analyst is immersed in the social reality they are part of and trying to explain. It's a conceptual and experiential critique, so there is an actual mix of the felt and the conceived. And as I said before, rhythm analysis at the very heart and core can be understood as a quest for appropriation of time and space. So we see the kind of ethical and pedagogical elements there that can be developed into a methodological framework. So the idea of rhythm analysis as an urban poetics is also a theory of praxis, effectively, that aims to transform, to turn the alienated existence brought about by capitalism into human flourishing and enjoyment through an enhanced critical consciousness of human practices, be them found in ideas, institutions, and cultures. So what we have in rhythm analysis is an incomplete, a suggestive, but nevertheless a transformative approach to research. The question for us and for you as guests in this seminar series is how to systematize and experiment while keeping true, in a sense, to the spirit of the urban poetic that is at the heart of rhythm analysis, but also extend it, and turn it into something new. In many ways, the fact that it is incomplete and suggestive makes the life of those who experiment easier. If the work is experimental, it's more approachable. We can literally enter the text and write the chapter within it. Between the lines of rhythm analysis, we can write a new rhythm analysis. And we also have, Sartre's point in Search of a Method, in a sense reassuring us that we ought to stay in the realm of the incomplete, because any type of intellectual quest needs to be undefined to keep being alive. Once we name and define the thing, we wrap it up, we tie the knot. In many ways, we kill the inquiry. What I find fascinating about the potentiality of rhythm analysis as a method is what Celia Lurie and Wakeford call the inventiveness of a method that can be found in the capacity of what emerges in the use of that method to change the problem. Has rhythm analysis this ability? I think it does. Another issue for methodological attempts at using rhythm analysis is, and I hinted at that beforehand, different nuances and interpretations, which could give rise to, different orthodoxies. So this seminar series really wants to be an invitation to us all involved in this work to read Lefebvre against itself, to take on the challenge of decontextualizing and recontextualizing his work, to make it methodologically relevant to current issues in human sciences, expanding fields beyond disciplinary constraints, but always putting at the center methodological inventiveness conducted with rigor. once, and this is the concluding slide of my presentation, once we talk about methodological innovation and experimentation, and so we talk about the method, we can never forget that the question of how to use rhythm analysis cannot and should not preempt onto epistemological considerations. So before getting to the how to use it, we ought to return to the what is it, which is one of the kind of haunting questions that recurs in the histories and the development of rhythm analysis as a concept, as an idea, even before getting to the method section. So and I raise this as points for your considerations and as questions or as lingering thoughts that will be with us during the course of these sessions. Should rhythm be a metaphysical category in its own right, as suggested by Alexei Eichelbund, for instance, alongside time and space, have rhythm as a metaphysical category? Should rhythm be turned to a political and ethical aesthetic, which is personally what I'm leaning toward, as something that is fundamentally concerned with the relational and differential production forces in the social, as Mangani suggests? Should we revisit the etymology of rhythm, finding new ways of combining rhythm in the Platonic understanding of embodied movement organized in time with the pre-Socratic root of rhythmos that invites us to delve deeper into that kind of mutable form that is always and already there as the condition for the possibility of experience, the ontologization of rhythm? Or should we carry forward the project of rhythm analysis as a critical theory of urban space and time that is fundamentally rooted in a critical realist ontology, taking forward, renewing it, a form of critical humanism? Or should we take on board the more ambitious task of bringing imagination at the center of our own methodological development, bringing back the idea and reviving it that rhythm analysis should be an experimental utopia and that should be directed to find a new style of existence based on the appropriation of our own time and space? Or should we nod more vigorously to new materialism by thinning the eye of the subject and hearing what the kind of fragmented echoes of subjectivity tell us in a much more, post-human style and paradigm? So in a nutshell, and this is my conclusion, what are the methodological possibilities of rhythm analysis? How can we translate a rhythm analytical sensibility thus defined into a viable research method? What forms of experimentation can and will take the rhythm analytical project forward? And last but not least, is Lefebvre's ambition to found a new science of rhythm achievable or even desirable? With that, I'll pass it on to Michel for the next section of this presentation. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fadia, for this very thoughtful introduction. And I think it really framed very well many of the questions and issues we may be interested in exploring altogether during this series of lectures and discussions. So regarding my own contribution, my entry point toward rhythm analysis has to do with rhythmic intelligence. In 2023, I introduced the previous research symposium series with a presentation titled Developing Rhythmic Intelligence Toward a Critical Understanding of Educational Temporalities. In that presentation, I discussed the genealogy of my current research on rhythmic intelligence and rhythm analysis, and the research agenda that I envision. My presentation was organized around 3 points. The first one presented the stages of development of my research on rhythmic intelligence. The second one proposed a working definition of the notion of rhythmic intelligence. And the third point briefly introduced an agenda of research that may be developed in relation to the study of rhythmic intelligence and rhythm analysis. I'm not going to repeat here what I presented then. If you're interested, I invite you to look at the video recording of that presentation, and I am going to post the link directly in the chat. And you can also, if you're interested, access directly the article that was at the origin of that presentation, where I've tried to define and frame what I mean by rhythmic intelligence. And here also I put the link in the chat. So today I'd like to briefly locate what is at stake from my point of view when we consider the exercise and the practice of rhythm analysis in relation to human-centered practices such as action research, educational practice, in therapy, coaching, or consulting, and even more broadly when we consider promoting social actions or fostering social changes. So maybe I should add here that my background is in psychology and in adult education and philosophy of education, and that's really where I come from and how I got to think about issue related to rhythm analysis. And another reference maybe I should mention here is actually the book I published a few years ago, which basically set in a way the roots of some of my thinking around the importance of time, temporalities, rhythms when we are concerned by the emancipatory aim of education. So that book was titled Time and the Rhythms of the Emancipatory Education. And it's actually also available in open access. So I'd like today to discuss three sets of questions that I think connect rhythmic intelligence and rhythm analysis. The first one is, what does it require to exercise rhythm analysis? Is it enough to have read elements of rhythm analysis, éléments de rythmanalyse in French, or La dialectique de la durée, which is one of the pioneer work of Gaston Bachelard, who was the first one in French to coin the term rhythm analysis, initially used for the first time in Brazil by Pinheiro de Santos. So the quick answer to this question is no, obviously, it's not enough to read about rhythm analysis. So we need to ask ourselves what knowledge and skills are involved when we consider practicing rhythm analysis. The thing is, there are plenty of activities and professions that involve the expert capacity to analyze rhythms. For example, rhythm is explicitly at the core of aesthetic experiences, such as those invested by poets, musicians, or dancers. When considering human experiences, and more specifically embodied one, rhythm may also be located literally at the heart of one's expertise. This is the case with cardiologists studying and taking care of arrhythmia, or chronobiologists specialized in the study of biological rhythms. Now, when we consider other human-centered practices, such as those involved in education, social work, or caregiving professions, we are talking about other forms of rhythms that are often less obvious to observe and analyze. Thus, psychologists, geographers, and anthropologists are paying close attention to rhythmic phenomena. Nevertheless, that does not mean that they have a reflective and critical understanding of what it takes to analyze rhythms that are of different natures. They may be physical, biological, psychological, social, and that's one of the key tricky issues when we talk about rhythm. Is there is the risk of what Pierre Sauvagny called panrhythmia, which is to mix different rhythms that are of different natures in a way that is uncritical. Because we're not talking about the same thing when we talk about the rhythm of our bodies, or the rhythms of the interaction within a group, or the rhythms that shape the way an institution functions. So that's, for me, a key issue. A core issue is to determine how does one learn and develop the capacity to discriminate, interpret, evaluate, argue, judge, and challenge rhythms that are observed or lived. Those questions led me to start theorizing the notion of rhythmic intelligence. I suggested to define it as an individual and collective ability to now understand and represent the rhythmic dimensions inherent in any organized, observed, or experienced phenomenon. It implies concrete and embodied modalities of apprehension of the real, as well as symbolic representation, including the use of metaphors or statistics. Such ways of knowing integrate and go beyond strictly discursive and logical aspects. So it's important here to really stress the fact that when I'm referring to the idea of intelligence, I don't reduce it to what IQ would be or something that we could just measure as a cognitive capacity. It's not just that. When we talk about rhythm, we are talking about embodied experience, we are talking about aesthetic experience as much as we are talking as social phenomena or psychological dynamics, for instance. So rhythmic intelligence also supposes a capacity of adaptation and problem solving, which implies an ability to feel and act in order to influence the rhythms that make up the physical, living, and human environments in which it is exercised, and to do it in a deliberate, strategic, and critical manner. And that's really the second meaning of the word intelligence here. It refers to that kind of strategic capacity to adapt and solve issues that we are facing. So for Lefebvre, it had to do with social alienation, and that's something that is at the core of our preoccupation today here at the TRC Lab. But there are different ways to refer to this idea of rhythm analysis and to develop the capacity of rhythmic intelligence. More fundamentally, the term refers to a capacity to establish and explore the relations and the connection that characterize the processes through which complex phenomena are organized. Finally, rhythmic intelligence can be envisioned through the function it fulfills in the development of privileged relationships within a given environment. It thus presupposes an ability to enter into resonance with others and with natural or social phenomena, likely to increase the quality and understanding of the lived experience. And so that's the third meaning of the word intelligence, this capacity to be in resonance. And I think with the idea of rhythm, it's particularly important because being able to analyze and to develop an understanding of the rhythms involved in a situation also allows us to be in touch literally with that context or that situation. And resonate, that means being also in sync in a way with the people or the different elements involved in that situation. And so that's not something we can take for granted. And I think for me, what's important with this idea of rhythmic intelligence is really that it brings to question how do we develop it. And that's what I'm interested in also in the framework of this series. So defining the notion of rhythmic intelligence opens the possibility to start questioning what goes into the development of a rhythm analytical capacity as a prerequisite to further develop people's ability to analyze the temporalities of their lives and their surrounding institutions. Reference to the notion of rhythm analysis requires one to conceptualize further what it involves in terms of knowledge, skills, learning, and development. Rhythmic intelligence is the notion I propose to identify, name, and gather an understanding of such phenomena. That is the lens I'm going to personally adopt as I will listen to our guest speakers during this semester. That being said, exercising rhythm analysis is not just about collecting information about phenomena observed or lived. It is also about influencing them, and that's something that appeared very clearly in Fadia's presentation earlier. It raises a second series of questions. What are the different settings that foster the praxis of rhythm analysis as a practice that shapes people's way of living? How can we effectively bring people to critically reflect on the rhythmic dimensions of their activities? In my work, I call it clinical rhythm analysis to distinguish it from a more kind of sociological and research-oriented perspective often found in the literature. I conceive clinical rhythm analysis as a form of accompagnement, as we would say in French, which has not a direct translation in English, would be something like coaching, but it's not as instrumental necessarily as coaching. It's the idea accompagnement means literally walking on the side of the people we are working with. So that form of accompagnement requires one to evolve next to the people we are observing or working with, helping them reflecting on the rhythms of what they are doing or experiencing. Here, I'm positioning myself closer to Gaston Bachelard's initial writing on rhythm analysis, inspired but also reacting to the early developments of psychoanalysis. From that perspective, rhythms are not only felt in the everyday life, they also constitute the fabric of our life, a fabric that is intertwined, that is made of intertwined threads of experiences that repeat themselves throughout one's life without being self-similar. That perspective also raises additional questions about the learning and skills the exercise of rhythm analysis involves. What does it look like to conceive a methodology that not only focuses on people's lived experience, but also aims at influencing the rhythms of their activities and more broadly of their life? How does one conceptualize such methods? How does one implement it? How does it relate to existing practices already used in education, therapy, coaching, or consulting, but that do not necessarily capitalize on rhythm theories or rhythm analysis? And that's for me a very important point. In a way, because rhythm are so important in our life, rhythm analysis somewhere is intuitively practiced by so many practitioners, whether in education or in therapy or in human-centered activities. But that doesn't mean that people are critically practicing an analysis of the rhythms involved in whatever situation they're working in. So that's for me is really a second set of core question that we should consider about the implementation and the development of such methods in a way that take very seriously what we can say about rhythm from informed by theory of rhythm. Finally, a third set of questions I would like to propose today comes from my desire to articulate and relate, on one side, Bachelard's perspective, which stresses the horizontal rhythms that compose the duration of historical development, whether conceived through the lens of a personal life history or the development of scientific discoveries. And on the other side, the perspective of Henri Lefebvre, more focused on the everyday's rhythm that compose a present situation. As Bachelard writes it, and that's my translation here, life is made vertically of instants, superposed and richly orchestrated. It relates to itself horizontally through the right pace of successive instants. To understand this difference, we can also use the musical analogy with harmony and melody. Harmony evokes rhythms and vibration that goes well together at the present time, where melody evokes successive notes and sounds that contribute to an organized whole inscribed in a longer duration. So when we consider rhythm analysis, how to conceive a method that focuses on both? The vertical dimension suggests one to pay attention to the present experience and the rhythms it involves and that eventually conflict with each other. Pupils interacting in a classroom, professionals exercising their expertise within a specific space and time. Considering rhythm vertically suggests one to pay attention to issues related to their synchronization or lack of synchronization. To illustrate that, are we all involved right now? Are some of us left behind? How to make sure that the pace of my discourse that I'm actually reading is in sync with the rhythms of understanding of my audience? Would the engagement would be different if I was improvising? Probably. So those questions relate to how we connect vertically, if you want to take that metaphor, different rhythms, the rhythm of the understanding, the rhythm of elocution, the rhythm of reading, the rhythm of thinking, and so on. Now, the horizontal dimensions refer to the development of a situation or the history of an individual or a collectivity. For instance, when I work with adult learners on their life history, because that's part of what I'm doing, asking people to share orally their life history or write their life history in order to learn about how they've evolved throughout their life. Part of our reflection may refer to the rhythms that emerge from the continuity and the discontinuities of people's life and the way they interpret them. Often a narrative, but the stress on the discontinuities, the ordeals, the epiphanies, those crises that punctuate one's life. But life is more than that. Life is also made of the recurrence of patterns and movements that reoccur at different periods of our life. Think, for example, about the history of our relationships we have, or the history of the different working positions that we occupy. So from that perspective, rhythm analysis requires the language and the capacity to describe rhythms evolving through different durations. For instance, the rhythms that form our intimate relationships, what I just mentioned, the history of our relation to work, that was the other example I mentioned earlier. Or, to take the example of this webinar, the history of the intellectual and professional background that may inform our current understanding of rhythm analysis and our capacity to get in sync, or at the opposite, to feel disconnected. So to go back to Lefebvre, I would say we are here in a very specific moment, a very specific category of experience that we are experiencing. That's the moment of webinar, the moment of learning with each other through an online setting, but also the moment of revisiting a specific theory, in this case, rhythm analysis. And this moment is built through the repetition of experiences, a repetition that reoccur throughout a span of time. So in the case of this webinar series, it will be 5 or 6 sessions that will build up a movement that has its own rhythmicity, if you want. That being said, as the rhythms of this research symposium series are going to unfold vertically and horizontally, I invite you to keep in mind those 3 questioning. And that's personally the one I'm going to mobilize in order to listen to the different people who will present their work and the research in this symposium series. First, how does one learn and develop rhythmic intelligence? That is, the capacity to critically discriminate, interpret, evaluate, argue, judge, and challenge rhythms that are observed or lived, and that compose processes of change and transformation that we may observe or experience. Second set of questions, what are the different settings and processes that foster the praxis of rhythm analysis as a practice that shapes people's way of living? And how does rhythm analysis relate to existing practices developed in human-centered profession? Again, the idea is not to reinvent the wheel, but to try to establish connection and relation with what people already do without necessarily naming it through the term rhythm analysis. Finally, the third set, how to conceive a method that embraces both issues related to the synchronization or lack of synchronization between the rhythms that shape a current situation, and the capacity to narrate and interpret the rhythms that compose the development or the history of an individual or a collectivity. Thanks for listening. Gaia, you have the mic now to introduce your own contribution to this research symposium series and open up the conversation with the audience.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you, Fadia and Monica in the background for allowing the new participants in the group. Well, I have a difficult, not too difficult transition to manage now. So for those who don't know me, I am based in Milan. I deal with adult learning, but also outside the university. So I work on community development projects, facilitating different organizations to come together, and citizenship as well. And I do network managing on introducing lifelong learning more strongly in academia in Italy, so a network of about 30 universities in Italy. And the questions of, therefore, how theories can be applied and can be learned together with people working in other settings. my research interests, and that's what I'm drawing on to do this little transition with you, have to do with relational, feminist, creative, cooperative approaches to learning. So I'm curious about different ways of knowing and systemic thinking, which is also part of my current training in systemic counseling. So I thought to take a couple of keywords, many words that we've heard so far in this time together to introduce this transition. There is something of rhythm analytic mode that has to do with connection. So connecting to experience. We've talked about materialities of thinking. So how our own thinking is actually coming from lived experience in and through our bodies, and how evocative objects around us trigger thinking. Thinking which goes from past to present to future. So all these dimensions are always present in the moment of the now. I'm especially inspired by feminism in challenging monolithic and abstracted ways of knowing and introducing other forms. So connecting to multimodality, aesthetic, embodied knowing, which is the basis of language. So people like Lakoff and Johnson theorized about how our words, our language come from lived experience. So we take a very small time to have a break from words and going back to words. But in the between of this transition, I ask you to translate through an evocative object, which can be image, artifact, something around you, an object on your desk, something you see from the window where you are, or something you make, a little doodling maybe, or a poem, or a memory that comes to you in this moment, or something that you feel in the body, a body part, which now is particularly present to you. So many possibilities. Translate what you think now, your thoughts, your feelings in this moment. You can take notes in any way you want and try to think of how it feels this moment. Can a word condense it? We take 5 minutes to do this, so it's an individual activity. I will take the time. I hope it's suggestive enough. If it's not clear enough, it's okay. And I'll call you back in 5 minutes.